Hi, I'm Stephen O'Grady. I'm the co-founder of Redmonk. I'm here today with Mike Milner. Mike, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. I'm Mike Milner, CTO over at Immunio. Immunio provides web application security as a service.
Outstanding. So I understand you have a little demo for us today. Basically, I think what we're here to talk about is not just the security process, but how to make the security process easier. So do you want to just actually drop us right into the demo?
Yeah, perfect. So something that's been going on a lot lately is credential stuffing attacks. So what's been happening is there's been a few big leaks. So there's a big LinkedIn one, Gawker, Adobe, and what hackers are doing is they're taking these leaked list of credentials, so usernames and passwords for literally hundreds of millions of users. And they're just taking all these usernames and passwords and trying them on other websites to try to find out if any of those usernames and passwords are being reused on other websites. Once they find a match, they can take over that account and do all sorts of nasty stuff. It's a really popular attack these days because it's relatively easy to do. You don't need to have in-depth hacking skills or anything like that. It's generally just a matter of putting together a little script to try out these usernames and passwords. And it's causing some big headlines as it's happening to some big major sites.
Well, I can imagine.
So I thought for the demo we'd walk through that use case and get an idea of how Immunio can protect you against this type of attack.
Yeah, sounds great. Yeah, because as you say, it is, it's a problem that, frankly, a lot of sites are having today. And, I think anecdotally, I won't put myself in this bucket, but I know a lot of people do share passwords. And, if you look at the password dumps from some of these, high-profile hacks, there are a lot of shared passwords. So this is essentially an attack that is going to be successful a reasonable percentage of the time. So
Yeah,
yeah, by all means,
exactly.
let's jump right in and see what you can do.
Great. So we've got this application here, WebGoat, and this is an open source application that's intentionally vulnerable. And it's got a whole giant group of other vulnerabilities that we're not going to talk through for this demo. All we're really looking at today is just this login page, username and password. And it works like you'd expect. You can try to log in, and we'll pick the number one most common password, 123456, and just see if that works. And it does an invalid username. Now, if I'm a malicious person, an attacker here, I can try lots of different usernames and passwords, and it's not going to do anything to stop me because generally these websites, if you're not kind of expecting this type of attack, you've built your website to scale. So you want to take all these failed login attempts, handle them as quickly as possible. We've seen some websites where they even scale up, auto-scale to handle the load of these attacks when you're actually making it easier. So I could sit here and type usernames and passwords all day long. But generally, many websites are not going to stop me.
Yeah, and I would
So
assume
what we've
a
done,
lot of them,
sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
certainly by default, are probably just not designed for this. As you say, they're basically just hey, the I want to do the basics. I want to accept username and password, and we move on. As opposed to, all right, well, let's think about what people are trying to do with passwords, and think about that intelligently and try to stop it. So yeah, I would assume. Well, actually, frankly, I know. In many cases, this is certainly the default. Having built having built authorization systems myself in the past, when you're short on time, you just want to get it built, and you're not necessarily,
Exactly.
you don't have the time or the budget to build in the kinds of features that check for this. So yeah, by all means, let's keep going.
Yeah, so you mentioned time to implement the protection, so I'm just going to show you quickly. If this is a Java application, to add Immunio's protection, we just modified the command line to add this extra option here, Java agent, Immunio, zero, the jar file from Immunio.
Right.
And then you just specify some credentials as environment variables or in a file, and that's it. Everything else I'm going to show you just required that one little change to my application. And this could be done in Tomcat or whatever, but here just a command line flag.
Okay.
So I've tried to log in a few times as admin here. So what basically an attacker is not going to sit here and type all day if they're, cared about time. So because they need to test millions of passwords, generally they write a script that's going to launch these attacks.
Right.
So I put together a small one here. And you can see some of the stuff that's happened in my testing. But basically, we've got a dumped list of credentials, passwords that go with them, and we've set it up to come from lots of different IP addresses. And what we're going to do is just start it up. And what's happening in the background is it's just hitting the website. Now, what I've done is put in some of these passwords into WebGoat. So as it scrolls by, you'll see most of them are failing, and this is pretty typical.
A couple of them are
but every once
now.
in a while. Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Some succeed.
Yeah.
So I'm going to leave that running in the background. And now we're going to take a look at the Immunio dashboard. So somebody's attacking the site right now. What does it look like? So if we flick over to the dashboard, we can see this is the app I just set up, our WebGoat app. It's red because it's detected that we're currently under attack. If you flick through, you can see the big spike from testing earlier, and we'll start to see a spike coming up here. It's showing the types of attacks, and as well you can see who's doing the most attacks. This top IP address right here, that's my own IP address where I'm coming from right now. And then the additional ones, these are the automated bot attacks that are running now in the background. And you can see we also track how many failed logins we're seeing across the site. That's part of our user account protection.
Yeah, look at that. Wow.
And you can see it's starting to climb.
Yeah.
And it's just going to keep climbing and climbing and climbing. Now, from the testing earlier, what we see is we actually can automatically stop these attacks by injecting a CAPTCHA. So every one of these failed login attempts, when we detect it, we can actually stop the attack by injecting a CAPTCHA. So I'm going to show you how easy that is to do here. So I'm going to go to my settings for my app. And you can see here it's set up just for detection. So I'm going to just set it up to do a CAPTCHA for all of my sort of account protection things. And then I'll save my changes. And this is going to take a second to propagate out to the agents, but relatively quickly we'll start to see over on the side, those are going to start to be blocked. And what we're going to see is over here, the number of CAPTCHAs served is going to start to increase. I can hear the fan on my system racing as it's trying to test all these passwords here. All right, I'm just going to double check that's taken effect. All right. The agents running in the protected website, they're not blocking requests as they go talk to Immunio to get the current setting. Mm-hmm. So what happens is it takes a little bit for this setting to take effect because we don't want to slow down legitimate traffic as well. Yeah. Okay, so you can already see here a lot of these guys have started to return an unrecognized response. So my bot is not getting the normal responses from the website that was written to expect. Yep. So nothing's succeeding. Mm-hmm. And what we're going to do, one of the IP addresses that is involved in this brute force attack is my own IP address. So we're going to go back to the login page and we'll see the website as the attacker would see it. So with their bots, what they're seeing is this. So again, with just that command line change, we've automatically injected this CAPTCHA into the website.
So walk me through. So in other words, we went in, we pressed sort of a couple of buttons, activated that, injected the CAPTCHA. So walk me through exactly how that's done, right? So in other words, we've activated this injection process. So what actually changes with the application? In other words, are you picking it off midstream and serving this? Can you basically take that apart in more detail?
Yeah, for sure. So installing the agent, when we saw at the very beginning that command line option, what that does is it injects Immunio into the web application flow. Mm-hmm. So Immunio now gets to see each request as it comes in. So right at the very start, it sees the request come in, and it sees the URL, it sees the request is coming from, And then as the request goes through the application, checking authentication, maybe managing sessions, actually doing the application functionality, each step along that line, including things like SQL queries to a database, templates being rendered, Immunio gets a chance to look at each one of those events.
Mm-hmm.
So what we see here is that Immunio at the authentication event is detecting the failures, and that's what we're using to classify these IP addresses as an attacker.
Okay.
Then once we turn on the CAPTCHA, so clicking that CAPTCHA button and clicking Save, that sends out a new configuration to all the agents so that they now know when they see an IP address that we consider bad, who's doing this brute forcing, that very first sensor, when that request first comes in and it sees the IP address, with the CAPTCHA enabled, that request is stopping right at that point. So instead of proceeding into the application and executing the application behavior, we're returning a response immediately. So these requests aren't actually going through the application at all. They're stopping right at the door.
Yep.
And we're injecting this CAPTCHA.
Nice. So what's the overhead, sort of associated with this? As far as sort of, intending to scale these applications, what can sort of developers anticipate, the performance hit being?
Yeah, so it varies a little bit depending on the platform.
Mm-hmm.
This is a Java application here, WebGoat, and for Java, our overhead is typically 2 to 3 milliseconds per request, extra overhead, which generally for most websites is just noise. It's a tiny compared to the overall request.
Sure.
It does vary a little bit depending on how your app works.
Yep.
So I mentioned the SQL detection, so we can actually detect injection attempts on your website. So if your website makes hundreds of SQL queries to render a single page, then each one of those queries is going to have a small, sub-millisecond overhead from Immunio.
Right.
So if you have a lot of queries, it's going to be slightly slower than if you just have one or two.
Okay.
Same way for templates being rendered. If your template, the page that you render is enormous, it's going to take a little bit longer to process that. But the 2 to 3 millisecond number I gave you is based on some common open source applications that we've used as benchmarks.
Okay.
So it's generally pretty typical for most apps.
Okay. Now we saw the integration stamp, the what's involved in the integration for a Java application. Is that sort of fairly standard? For other applications, is it similarly straightforward to implement?
Yeah, it's very similar. Java is slightly different where it has this dedicated, you can see it on the command line, this Java agent interface.
Mm-hmm.
So for Java, it's just on the command line. For something like Python, it's just a single import statement at the start of your app. You just say import immunio.start.
Yep.
Ruby on Rails, you just add Immunio to your gem file.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So it's a very similar experience for every platform we support.
Okay. Yeah. So, how do you, when you go out and talk to developers or companies about, this type of problem, what do you see them doing to tackle it now? Sort of as we addressed, a lot of them out of the box probably aren't doing anything because it's, all right, I just want to get this thing up as quickly as possible and I'll worry about the security later. But for folks that have been doing this for a little longer and have tackled this problem, what do you see, the sort of the typical response being? Like, how do they handle it? I mean, are they writing everything from scratch? What is the typical handling for this type of attack look like?
Yeah, so often it's custom integrations. What we'll often see is, point solutions. So a particular website, maybe they've started seeing this credential stuffing behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe they, at that point, have written something custom to handle credential stuffing like we've talked here.
Right.
And you'll notice here, this is a bot doing all these tests coming from a few different IP addresses. In this example, I think it's around 20 different IP addresses.
Okay.
And because it's still trying a lot of usernames and passwords, just the basic rate limiting has detected this.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe a website would implement this, but the attackers aren't standing still. So After this starts getting stopped, then they'll go to bigger and bigger botnets. So instead of 20 IP addresses, maybe they're using hundreds of thousands.
Sure.
And now the pure rate limiting approach no longer is really effective.
Right.
So then you're forced to allocate more engineering resources to try to solve this next problem. And then the attackers will evolve again. And then you have to spend engineering resources to solve this next problem. And that's normally when people get seriously interested in products like Immunio.
Sure.
Because we allow them to basically make one change, installing Immunio, and then we handle responding to different attacker behavior. So instead of your engineers having to always play catch up against attackers, Immunio does that for you,
right.
And then you can focus on actually, like you said, getting the thing to work and making your website, amazing for your actual customers,
right.
Instead of trying to tackle the attackers who are trying to abuse it.
Yeah.
That's when people get very interested.
Yeah, I'm sure. So in terms of the sort of premise, from a developer standpoint, okay, sort of I get this, I get the sort of the nature of the attack, I get how you can handle this. Is the easiest way for them to sort of pitch it internally? So, do you guys talk about this sort of as security as a service, so to speak?
Yeah, absolutely. It's most development shops these days, everything's not done in-house. You're using other services to, take anything that's not core to your product. Ideally, you don't want to be spending all your time developing it. It's much, much easier to use some other service. So you could implement your own Graphite server and StatsD server, but it's much easier to use something like Datadog because it's taking away a lot of the overhead and allowing your development team to focus on your product instead of re-implementing kind of this common boilerplate functionality. And we look at security as a very similar concept. You can spend a lot of your engineering time embedding this security behavior into your application, but that means you're not developing your application functionality anymore. You're solving these security problems. With Immunio, we're able to take most of those problems off your hands and basically defend your website for you to let you focus on that. Just like you would use Datadog to make it so you don't have to write the monitoring code yourself.
Yeah, and it frankly, it's a trend that we see sort of increasingly, right? We talk about applications as being composed, sort of in many cases today, largely of services. And, you see this sort of most obviously in terms of mobile applications, right? Because most mobile applications at the heart are essentially a wrapper for, services, right? They're a wrapper for things like geo or authentication, sort of pieces like that. And, increasingly we're seeing externally facing web applications, from an enterprise standpoint, built the same way. Because they're coming to some of the same conclusions, which are, look, if I'm building a mobile application, is it really feasible for me to build a mapping service, right? A legit, sort of geo service that's going to compete with people who do that professionally? The answer is no, it's not. And, similarly, I think, really what we're beginning to see are developers extending that concept to new areas, and certainly security is one of them, because again, having built these things in the past and having built very rudimentary protections in the past, I can't speak for other developers out there, but I certainly was not as good at it as professionals would be.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's such a broad, like we've demoed credential stuffing here, but just by that same installation of Immunio, you're also protecting against all these other types of attacks. Right. That maybe you're not even aware of or thinking of at the moment, but the attackers, they're thinking of them. So it's a good safety blanket for lots of attacks.
Do you see developers who go in and sort of turn these on and off, or do they typically sort of leave them enabled all the time? What's the most typical behavior?
Generally, most of our customers start out with everything in detection mode.
Okay.
It doesn't affect the behavior of the application, so it's a very low barrier to entry. It's easy to install, and they know it won't change anything, but it gives them good view into how Immunio works. So you can then see what Immunio is detecting. And that kind of gives them confidence that we're seeing the right things, and then they go in and enable protection because they want us to actually stop them. And once they're in protection mode, generally they just leave us protecting their web applications so that they don't have to worry about it.
Yeah, because why wouldn't you? Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So, okay, so for developers who are interested in learning more, where should they go? What's the easiest way for them to try this out and to essentially explore the features that you offer?
Yeah, the easiest way, go to our website. We've got lots of material, lots of background reading on account takeover, code protection, all these various things we've talked about here. And they can sign up for a free trial and give it a go.
Outstanding. All right. Thanks so much, Mike. This is Steve O'Grady, and I'm signing off for another Redmonk moderated screencast. So thanks, Mike.
Thank you very much, Stephen.
Cheers.